Welcome to PM in the PM. This is my podcast where I take a recent event and look at how it links to the ACCA syllabus areas, in particular the performance management syllabus area. The benefit of listening to this is I use real world examples and show how they link to the syllabus areas, and hopefully then you'll be able to apply these to your questions and to the answers. However, you'll see we're taking a slightly different approach today. We're actually looking at the process of learning, effective learning, rather than specific syllabus areas. I'm sure there were plenty of football fans who were watching the UEFA Cup and watched Morata from Spain miss his penalty, and they were probably thinking they would have scored that. Maybe you were one of those people. Or maybe F1 is your thing, and maybe you watched the Canadian Grand Prix this weekend, you saw what Norris did and you were thinking, there's no way I would have done that. Or maybe tennis is your sport. Maybe you're a big tennis fan. My mum loves tennis. And maybe you're looking forward to Wimbledon in a few weeks, and perhaps you'll be watching some players miss some shots and you think, oh, I'd have made that. Or perhaps you watch a debrief video of an ACCA question, or you look at a model answer and you think to yourself, yeah, I'd have said that too. And this is what psychologists call the illusion of competence. And it's a cognitive bias. It's where our subconscious brain tricks our conscious brain into believing something that isn't true. And it's one of the reasons why PM students, performance management students, underperform. The illusion of competence has a couple of other names. It's also called fluency illusion or passive learning bias. And what happens is a learner observes a correct answer or a worked example or a video debrief, and they mistakenly believe they would have produced that same output themselves, when in fact they wouldn't have. And it's because they develop a false sense of mastery. Maybe the material seems familiar or makes sense when they see someone talking about it or they read about it, but it isn't the case that they would have retrieved or generated it themselves. Let's link back to Wimbledon and the tennis. From your sofa, 120 mile an hour serve doesn't actually look that fast. You can see the ball clearly. You can see where it landed. You think the player had time, and it feels like you'd have returned it too. But in reality, had you been there, you'd have probably swung your racket 3 seconds too late. And that's because watching a skill isn't the same as doing it. And in PM, I see this all the time. Students read articles, they read notes, they highlight notes, they read textbooks, they watch YouTube summaries, they watch debrief videos, and they consume tons of information, and it feels like they've done loads and loads of work. But then perhaps they're asked to do a Section C question, 20-mark question from scratch, and they can't answer it, or they do something generic and messy. And although they've seen what a good answer looks like, they haven't tried to produce it under pressure, and they suffer from this illusion of competence. And I mentioned PM, but it happens across all parts of the syllabus area. And here's the truth. Reading isn't the same as studying. Watching isn't the same as writing. Knowing isn't applying. You can only learn, your brain can only learn when it's forced to work. You have to force your brain to retrieve. You have to force your brain to generate. You have to force your brain to explain. You have to force your brain to compare, and you have to force your brain to justify. You need to push your brain to its limit in order to establish new neural pathways, which is basically what learning is. The brain has this function called neuroplasticity, where new connections can be made or connections between the nerve cells can be altered, and that is how learning happens. And by doing that, by using that neuroplasticity, you're increasing your chance of recalling information in the exam, and you're increasing your ability to apply that information. Now, the science behind this goes back to 1909, so 116 years, and over that time it's been retested and re-examined, and there's a plethora of evidence on this. Over 250 studies in peer-reviewed journals have happened since 1909. So this isn't some sort of a newfangled idea. The science is out there. The science has been done. And just like if you want to increase your muscle size, you go to the gym, but you need to push your muscles to their limit in order for them to grow. And it's exactly the same with your brain. So how do you fix this? How do you move away from this illusion of competence into actually getting your brain to be able to recall information better and also apply that knowledge in the exam? Here's a simple 4-step process you can follow, and I'll call it closed book, open book, gap analysis, fill the gap. First, you attempt a question, closed book and to time. By closed book, not reading your notes, and time yourself based on the amount of time you should be using in the exam for that same question. Even if you don't finish that question, even if you're not fully sure of the answer, even if you do a really bad attempt, it doesn't matter. Doing that closed book approach first is pushing your brain to its limit. Like I said about the gym, this is you pushing your brain as far as it can go based on what you know, based on your knowledge. And then open book is stage 2. You improve your answer using open book. You use your notes or you use your study texts, and you can use as much time as you want on this bit, and you go back to your original answer and then you make it as good as you can get it using those additional resources. And then next is the gap analysis, and ideally you would have someone competent mark your work for you and give you detailed and customized feedback. I realise that's not always possible, and the other way to do it is to watch a video debrief maybe, or to read a model answer. So what you're doing now is helping your brain to understand the gap, i.e. the gap between what you thought was correct and what is actually correct. And that's where the real learning happens. Firstly, by identifying that gap, ideally from someone else marking your work for you, or by watching a debrief or reviewing a model answer. And then the next stage is to fill that gap. And that's what's called deliberate practice. Maybe you'll make a flashcard to capture the bits of knowledge that you didn't have that would fill that gap. Maybe you'll rewrite your notes on that. Maybe you'll explain it to a friend or a colleague. You could record an audio clip of yourself explaining it. There are many ways you can use deliberate practice to fill that gap that was in your knowledge. And what you've done there is you've pushed your brain to its limit. You've told your brain the bits it doesn't know, and then you've used deliberate practice to teach your brain those things. And that's when those neural pathways will change and your brain is starting to learn, starting to increase its ability to recall that information. And there is another element to this, and I call it the collector's trap. And I see this where people are using different courses, or they're looking at notes and articles and videos. There's useful information out there, but what they're doing is they're collecting material, they're not studying. They're reading stuff, they're watching stuff, but they're not ever testing, they're not ever pushing their brain to that boundary where it needs to go in order to increase their knowledge, to improve their understanding. They're effectively building a library, not getting themselves ready for the exam. So, simple advice this week when you're studying, make sure you incorporate all of the learnings that the science behind this has told us. So before you just watch another video or skim read another article, stop and think. Can you do a question? Do a question on this. Push yourself to the limit. Do it closed book first. Then do it open book. Identify the gap and then fill that gap with deliberate practice. At first you'll think it's going to take a lot longer, and it probably does take a bit longer, but the value you'll get out of that is much more useful. And if you consistently do that, you'll move from thinking, I would have said that, to actually writing it, actually saying it when it counts. So that's it from PM in the PM today. Hopefully this episode has helped you reflect and given you some value that you can use in your studies going forward. Please share it with any fellow students who maybe are watching videos or reading articles and not actually writing, not actually testing themselves. Please leave any feedback you've got in the comments section. And if you're looking to study PM at any point and you want some help from me as a tutor, please check out my courses. I love helping students get through this really challenging topic of performance management. Thanks for listening.